Last time we talked about the types of psyche structure. What else should be said about them? The type of psyche structure, which is generated by the people themselves, that is, in which various kinds of psychotropics participate, is such that it pulls man out of various kinds of things in the course of which intervals of time? Let's suppose between two urges to smoke. For some it's an hour, for some 2, and others smoke, lighting another cigarette from the one they are smoking now. Further, this is the animal type of psyche structure. It is based on the service to instinctive behavioral programs, which are also quite short in duration. The zombie type of psyche structure is culturally conditioned behavioral programs that are oriented mainly on solving everyday tasks. And the duration of every one of them is also insignificant. And if you look at life, it turns out that all short processes are fragments of longer ones, or flow against their background, or in their direction. In fact, it turns out that the one who is able to control processes of a longer duration is in power over those who are not able to control them. And since every endeavor requires a certain mood, then if the urge for a smoke pulls man out of a certain mood for 20 to 30 minutes each time, then processes of a longer duration are not accessible to him, or the quality of governance in them is low. So, all types of structure of the psyche line up one after the other according to the duration of the processes that each of them is able to control. So it turns out that culturally conditioned behavioral programs are within the limits of man's life, and the demonic type of psyche structure and the human type of psyche structure, realizing their creative potential, can generate processes that are manifoldly longer than man's life. It turns out that the demonic type has limitations, since the demon focuses on its resources, and they are limited. And the human type of psyche structure, since activity under this type of psyche structure is carried out in interaction with the Almighty, co-participates with eternity. But nonetheless, the difference in the types of psyche structure is only the difference in the informational algorithmic structures of the psyche. And what happens in the psyche itself? And in the psyche itself, there is a worldview and world understanding. They, as models of the world, must provide, at a proactive pace, multivariate modeling of events, so that we can choose one single variant, or a set of variants, by which we will be guided in our activities, and which we will implement. Since many people want to have a perfect worldview and a perfect world understanding, the question arises of how to achieve this. And here we run into a question that can be called the key question of psychology as a science. Because man comes into the world when his worldview and world understanding are absent. There are only prerequisites for the creation of them. And then, when man grows up, some people become psychologists and begin to deal with questions about how a worldview is formed, how a world understanding is formed. The peculiarities of Western scientific thought are such that Western science thinks not in processes, but in states. In most cases, in stable states. And how the object turns out to be in such a stable state, in the majority of cases, this does not interest science. As for psychology, the situation is such that if the psyche is informationally empty, there is no personality either. There is simply no need to talk about the types of psyche structure or anything else. And this leads to the question of how primary information gets into man's psyche. Or, in other words, is man self-sufficient in distinguishing the signal from the background? The signal carries information to him, and the background is just the background that accompanies the signal. In some situations, the background may be such that it suppresses the signal, and the perception of information is difficult or impossible. But the question is whether man is self-sufficient in separating the signal that carries information and the background that does not carry this information. Depending on how we answer this question, we will get this or that plurality of theories of psychology, which will be compatible with each other in far from everything, and in some cases, they will even contradict each other. Well, the world in which we live is one and the same. Therefore, this question is really important, since everything we encounter in life is the product of the psyche of people living today and the psyche of past generations. Psychology, in order to really be a key science, must clearly answer such questions. But they are not even posed in it, although psychology, as a science, has existed in Western culture for at least 2 centuries, at least from the beginning of the 19th century. Some people have already begun to deal with questions of psychology as such, as a narrow discipline. Herewith, I repeat once again that psychiatry took shape earlier as a practice, and from the psychology to which Western science gave birth, there are no bridges, either into psychiatry, not into pedagogy, no bridges anywhere. Psychology exists by itself as a beautiful intellectual toy that people play with, and far from everyone can solve the problems they face. And one of the reasons for this is precisely the fact that psychology does not answer this question. Is man free? Is he self-sufficient in distinguishing between signal and noise, signal and background? If we assume that man is self-sufficient in this, there arise questions to which there are no answers. Why do people strive for the same objectives, but some successfully achieve them, while others cannot achieve them? Because there is no corresponding informational algorithmic support, and they are not able to work it out. Why do some people strive for objectives, while other people don't notice these objectives, or someone needs to point out for them the need to achieve these objectives? there arises the illusion that man is self-sufficient. Why? Because in most cases, man's psyche, in the process of interaction with the surrounding world, works in the mode of juxtaposition of the flow of information that his senses bring now with what is already in his psyche, with the model of the world that already took place sometime in the past. On the basis of this correlation, a line of behavior is worked out. Yes, the worldview and world understanding change, but they change very slowly in relation to most events that take place in life. To put it differently, the dynamics of life is faster than the dynamics of modification of the worldview and world understanding, on the basis of which the course of events in life is modeled. And since in this mode man really self-governs, and external informational impacts are either completely absent or extremely rare, then an illusion of self-sufficiency arises. And if you ask the question of how the worldview and world understanding takes shape during the period of man's growing up, then what will happen? And it will be as follows. In this period, every day, especially the closer to birth, the more novel information it brings. I emphasize novel information, that which has never been in the psyche before. And there are estimates that 90% of life information is received by children under the age of 5. According to other estimates, around the same but under the age of 10. This depends on how to count. And the rest, this is already later. If we turn to adulthood, because we don't remember early childhood very well, then we can see that not everyone can remember what happened to them before the age of 1 up to 2. Maybe someone has some single bright episodes, but unwinding the entire film of life, for most people, this is a problem. What happens in adulthood? In adulthood, although not often, there are situations when a person seems to see something, seems to be worried about something, but does not perceive from the world what is in it. And then, all of a sudden, inspiration rolls over him, and what he has known for a long time, what he encounters every day, suddenly in this something, he sees something new for himself. And in such situations, if you remember them, it's impossible to say that this is the result of our own efforts of some kind. Like the archaeologists on excavations, first they work with a shovel, then with a brush, then they find something, and here it is, what they need. It happens somehow by itself, spontaneously. Why does it happen spontaneously? Because the perception by us of the world, this is not only the work of our sense organs. This is also the work of our intellect, the unconscious levels of the psyche. There are studies that show cases, although rare, but very indicative, where if a person loses sight in early childhood, at an early age, then in adolescence or adulthood, medicine is already able to restore his sight. Then for some time, he learns to use sight. Because in the psyche, algorithms work out for processing those impulses that the light flow excites in the retina, and transfers from the retina to the nervous system. There are some examples that show that we see not only with our eyes. Here is a reproduction of a postcard. What's on it?
Цветок какой-то, листья.
A flower and leaves. At the time of the Restoration, that is, after Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Saint Helena, in France, one could go to prison for this postcard. Why? Because on it, in the image of flowers, profiles of Napoleon are encrypted. This one here is a cocked hat, and here is a nose and a profile. His wife Eugénie de Beauharnais. Here is the lady's hat, but here below, if you look, this is the profile of his son. That is, this is an example of conspirology of the first half of the 19th century, and a kind of password, that if a comrade sees this picture, he knows that there are not only flowers on it, then he ends up in the house of Napoleon's adherents. But in order to see this, one needs to know something. Here's another picture. Who sees what here? This is a well-known picture, widely known. Some see an old woman, others see a young girl. There are also pictures on the theme where the ballerina is moving, and there is much more. And here is a picture that shows that the image processing is nraviously conditioned. What is depicted here? The picture is really well known, since we present it in the foundations of sociology. In general, adults see a man and a woman in the process of mutual caresses, and children who do not know what it is see 9 dolphins here. Adults rejoice like children as soon as they manage to find the first dolphin. This is a direct indicator that the result of intellectual activity, including image processing which flows by itself, if you don't touch upon the issues of signal processing, is just some plurality of spots. But the situation is exactly the same with sounds. Because if the Arabs distinguish around 4 or 5 sounds, which for us are either g or kh, then this is not because our ears are not as good as those of the Arabs, but because the organization of their psyche, in the aspect of processing, has such a sound signal that provides this distinction of sounds. And for us, by virtue of the peculiarities of our language, there are no fundamental differences whether we pronounce g, Russian, or h, Ukrainian. In the Russian language, these sound differences do not carry any information, but in the Arabic language, these are already differences that carry different meanings. It is almost the same with the Japanese, who don't know the letter L, the sound L, and replace it with R. This raises the question, how do they mispronounce their R's? There is another interesting thing. If you look on the internet, how in different languages the meowing of cats and the squawk of parrots is transmitted in vocabulary. It also turns out that different representatives of different cultures hear it completely differently. And it's unlikely that having familiarized yourself with how a rooster crows from the point of view of a Frenchman, that you will agree that this is something close to our Russian kukariku. In other words, there is really a question that requires an answer. The Quran gives a direct answer to this question. Surah 8, verse 29. O you who have believed, in case you are pious to God, He will set for you an all-distinctive criterion. The term all-distinctive criterion in the Quran occurs repeatedly. In some cases, the Arabic word furqan is translated into Russian as distinction, and in other cases as salvation. But if you look at life from the standpoint of the theory of governance, then provision of information, for now we are considering the process as a purely informational one, without correlating it with life, with results. It is really a distinction between signal and background. But if we correlate with real life, then the absence of necessary information is fraught with disaster. Provision of necessary information is salvation. In maritime law, if an oncoming ship asks you for coordinates, this is equivalent to the fact that you are conducting a rescue operation. By providing your true coordinates to that ship, you save it. Because if it loses its place at sea, then this is fraught with disaster. Therefore, the definition of this Quranic word as salvation and distinction in both senses is indeed life-consistent. But the Quran, with this phrase, elucidates that man is not self-sufficient in the aspect of distinguishing between signal and background. The reality is such that this distinction between the signal and the background is given to the person by God directly, according to the nraviousness of this person, in accordance with those views on the person and his future that God has in relation to him. When an epiphany by distinction occurs, the world splits into two components. This, that which is highlighted in distinction, and not this, everything else. That is, the information is provided in a binary code. What happens further? Further, it turns out that the person can be inattentive. And if he's inattentive, then this flash of epiphany by distinction has passed. As in the night, a flash of lightning illuminates the landscape for a second or two. Everything becomes visible for many kilometers around. Then the lightning extinguishes, and it becomes dark again. And then the variants are such that the person can either remember or not remember. He pays attention, does not pay attention. If he did not pay attention, then that which was revealed to him in distinction goes somewhere in the depths of his memory, and it remains there, still isolated from everything else that's in the psyche. And if the person paid attention, then the process goes on of intellectual processing of what is given in distinction, as a result of which it takes some place of its own in the mosaic picture of the world. And while children are small, these epiphanies by distinction are frequent, because the main task of the child is to prepare for adult life. And one of the aspects of this preparation is the formation of a worldview and world understanding. And here it turns out that since creation is limitless, and man's psyche as an informational algorithmic system is limited, the question arises, how can the limitlessness of creation, life, be reflected in this limited system? And the answer is that this is only possible on account of discretization. To put it differently, there where in the world there really is some plurality, in the psyche to this plurality corresponds some one object, image, and system of interconnections of this object with all other objects in the psyche, which in some way should be generated by our intellect.
А пример можете привести, чтобы понять, как это вот бесконечность какого-то явления, а у нас это вот рамки?
Ну как?
Well, behind the window there is a landscape. In a digital photo, in what is the landscape reflected?
Просто квадратики.
In a final set of pixels. And by what is this landscape behind the window represented? By houses. And what does every house consist of? Of bricks. What is every brick made of? Of molecules, and so on and so forth.
Да, но тем не менее мы же разбиваем это, что дома, кирпичи.
Yes, but these are our conditionnesses. Because if we talk about where the border lies between two atoms, then we recall Schrödinger's formula, which is the probability density of the distribution of an elementary particle in this world. And where we think that an electron is a point in an orbit, there is simply a maximum density. But the electron, with some significantly lower probability, at the same time, can be located many parsecs, tens and hundreds of light years away. Why though? Because if you perceive the electron as a wave in the ether, then where is the beginning of one wave, and where is the end of the other? That is, the question is not the easiest one. In addition, if we talk about the electron, then there is another anecdote. The anecdote supposedly took place in real life. There was such a physicist, Dirac, Paul Adrien Maurice Dirac. He called one of his friends, being in a state of drunkenness, and asked the question, why are all electrons the same? Since it was the middle of the night, his friend was very much surprised and could not find an answer. And Dirac said, because it is one and the same electron. He laughed and hung up.
Дирак один из основоположников квантовой механики.
Да.
Yes. And here the difference is such that the question is only in how many elements make up the picture of the world of every one of us, and which areas have been worked out in more detail, and which have remained less worked out. And since the metaphor picture of the world is really very voluminous and relevant, we can also talk about the difference between the European tradition of painting, the Japanese tradition of painting, and the ancient Egyptian one. The European tradition of painting presents us with any object, I'm not talking about the abstractionists, but the classics, from one point of view. And with the advent of photography, the European tradition of painting began to experience a crisis. Especially with the advent of color photography, especially when there appeared Photoshop and similar things that allow one to remove unnecessary objects from photography. If we orient on the needs of people, then an anecdote from the times of the 1990s comes to mind. There is an artist standing and drawing. A new Russian with his son is passing by. And the new Russian says to his son, "Look, the man has a hard time without a Polaroid." Polaroid, this is already yesterday. And this is the world's first photography system, in which the image was obtained on paper, literally within a few minutes after shooting. Japanese painting tradition. Yasuhiro Nakasone once gave an interview on Russian television to Urmas Ort. Among other things, there was a question about how he spends his free time, and he said that painting is one of his hobbies. And he recalled the case when he once talked with Reagan and explained to him what the difference is between Japanese painting and European painting. In European painting, the entire frame is filled with paints and some images. In Japanese painting, white spaces are always present. Nakasone explained that this was not just for nothing, but so that the viewer could supplement with his imagination what the artist did not draw, and thereby also take part in the work. If we remain on the position of the purely European view on the world, that is, we look from one point and draw from this point, then Egyptian painting appears simply as an inability to draw. Because a person is drawn in profile, and his eye is drawn as it should be on a full face, his legs go from the side. If this is a landscape, then there's a mixture of a type of plan and something else. And many simply believe that by strength of the fact that the vision of the world that they perceive through the ancient Egyptian painting is not the same as they are used to seeing in the window or in the same landscapes of Egypt. They think that the Egyptians simply did not know how to draw. But if we understand that the perception of a picture is conditioned psychologically, then there is reason to believe that the generation of a picture is also conditioned by the psychology and culture of the world perception of a person. And one of the variants for the state in which a man is able to perceive the world is characterized by the fact that if man looks at an object, then he sees this object simultaneously from different angles, from the inside and outside. And accordingly, if one tries to display such a vision of an object on a plane, then one will get something close to the Egyptian painting or something close to modern mechanical engineering drawing, when the object is presented in several projections. There can be sections along different planes, or some sections along some indirect lines, views from the inside, views from the outside, and so on and so forth. But this is a different view on the world, and it is simply captured in painting. Why this way? Because if you want to have an idea of an eye, then it's better to look at it from a frontal view. And if about the characteristics of people, then the profile is more informative than the frontal view. The art of cutting a profile from black paper was also popular at one time, although painting existed in parallel with the European one, including highly developed portrait painting. What, then, is the development of worldview and world understanding? If the worldview and world understanding is some kind of a system discrete and interconnections between them of integral, indivisible elements and interconnections between them, then the development of the world understanding is an increase in the total number of elements, both on account of expansion of the field of view of this picture of the world and on account of the creation of a multi-layer, more detailed elaboration of some fragments that have not been previously worked out in detail. And if the question arises of adding some integral, indivisible new elements instead of previously existing ones or in addition to them, then from the point of view of theory, this is a resolution of non-determinacies. Only answers to determined questions, determined answers, allow one to resolve non-determinacies. We live in such a time that in the majority of cases, the attitude towards philosophy, when it's offered to be studied in higher educational institutions, is couldn't care less, especially in relation to the study of the philosophical systems of the past. This is typical not only for the present time, it was also typical for the Soviet era. And in earlier times, people with a certain mindset became philosophers. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, if a person lives and is not an appendage to his workplace, if he has any interests besides physiological, then, to him, questions of philosophy are interesting. This interest stems from the fact that philosophy in the entire system of sciences of modern civilization is functionally analogous to a tuning fork, and in many respects, similar to it. Let's take a look. Philosophy, any philosophy, cannot by itself solve a single practical task. Practically all tasks are solved by one or another applied discipline. A tuning fork cannot be an instrument for performing even a primitive melody like chizhik-pizhik. But if there is an orchestra and the musicians don't have perfect pitch, then the orchestra cannot be tuned without a tuning fork. If philosophy, like a tuning fork, is out of tune, then the entire totality of particular scientific disciplines turns out to be internally conflicting. As a result, it turns out that scientific activity and practical activity, on the basis of the recommendations of science, are accompanied by these or those negative effects. If there are several tuning forks in the orchestra, and, for example, the wind instruments are tuned in one way, and the string instruments are tuned in a different way, and the tuning forks are different, one, for example, has a normal La, and the other has Do, and everyone thinks that this is La, then this will be a mess. We have a pluralism of philosophical systems. And the evaluation of all the philosophical systems that took shape in the middle of the 19th century is given by the aphorism of Kosma Prutkov. The philosopher easily triumphs over the future and past sorrows, but he is easily triumphed over by the present ones. The key to understanding this aphorism is that the Russian word for present has two meanings, present and real. The future and past sorrows really exist at the present time, but only in the psyche of the philosopher. If this psyche is inadequate, then over the future and past sorrows, which are completely in his power, he easily triumphs, because they exist only in his imagination, and he can do whatever he wants with them. But if his worldview is inadequate, then the actual sorrow differs from his view on it, and it triumphs over him. When we studied, the dominant philosophy in the USSR was dialectical materialism. We studied the laws of dialectics, and Marx took the laws of dialectics from Hegel. And Khomyakov gave an evaluation of Hegel's philosophy, saying that Hegel had accomplished an intellectual feat, having created a philosophy that cannot be used, because our inner consciousness is much more powerful than our logical consciousness, and we, for the most part, think at the level of consciousness with words. What is the reason? Our right and left hemispheres are developed in different ways. It is believed that man is supposedly superior to all else, because his left hemisphere is more developed than the right one. But there is another opinion. The right hemisphere, during the life of the past global civilization, was oppressed, and this oppression was genetically entrenched, so that man, through logic and lexicon, could be governed in the same way as we govern a computer in a formal logical language. Everything that concerns those images and phenomena that stand behind the identifiers of the program, on which we build some computational processes, this is not the competence of the computer. This is all the competence of the programmer and the program orderer. It is believed that in the past global civilization, the bulk of the population was slave races, and in order not to create problems for themselves, the master race took care of suppressing the right hemisphere. The imagery of conscious thinking was not characteristic of most people. Nevertheless, a worldview is a combination of some indivisible elements and interconnections, and it develops only on account of questions that are determined in their meaning and the receiving of answers that are determined in their meaning. If you turn to the Russian Encyclopedic Dictionary and look at the article of Socrates, then you can read there that Socrates is one of the founders of dialectics as a method of comprehending the truth by posing leading questions. If so, then what is the history of the development of philosophy in subsequent times after Socrates? The opinion is imposed on us that dialectics received the highest development in the philosophy of Hegel in the 19th century. Further, disputes begin about whether Marxism is correct or incorrect, and whether dialectics received its laws, its development, in the teachings of any other philosophers. And The reality is such that in subsequent times, after Socrates, the history of philosophy was not the history of the development of the art of dialectics as a process in a certain personal psychic culture. It was the history of the substitution of dialectics as an art for some logics. Because if we turn to the laws of dialectics in their generally accepted formulations in Marxism, we will get paradoxical conclusions if we try to apply Marxism to objective reality as such. The first law of dialectics is the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. It assumes duality, pairing. So, there is one thing, there is another, they struggle. But if you really look at how wars proceed, of which there have been many in the history of mankind, it turns out that many wars were not a struggle between two opponents. But behind both opponents, there was a third party, which in some way organized their military clash, and then maybe it took part in it, maybe it didn't, but it dictated the terms of peace when both sides fizzled out. For example, the First World War of the 20th century is believed to have been the result of excessive German ambitions to build a railway through Istanbul to Baghdad. If you look at the memoirs of Grand Admiral Tirpitz, there is a very interesting detail. The Germans quite correctly estimated that in the military-economic respect, after the Russo-Japanese War, Russia was not yet ready to fight. Accordingly, Kaiser Wilhelm had one very simple task. He wants to fight while Russia is weak, and the Kaiser, in addition to everything else, wrote in his diaries that he simply hates the Slavs with all his soul, although he realizes that before God, it is a sin to hate people. So he wants to fight. Russia is weak. Chances are that the war will end in the favor of Germany. But Russia has an agreement with France. Again, there is England. How will it be? In order to probe the situation, Prince Henry of Prussia went to Great Britain shortly before the war. When he returned, he reported to his father that the English king had told him, in a sincere conversation, that the showdown in the Balkans was such a trifle for which England would not intervene in the war. The only German in the German leadership who understood that this was a bluff was Grand Admiral Tirpitz. He tried to explain to the Kaiser that this was all a deception, a setup. But the Kaiser said that the word of the king was enough for him. And Germany entered the war. 3 days later, England announced that it was joining the war, but there was no turning back. When the February Revolution took place, the British Parliament said that one of the objectives of the war had been achieved. When the German Empire collapsed, the second objective of the war was achieved. This does not fit into the law of the unity and struggle of opposites, because there was a governing third party. which was neither one nor the other opposite, but pursued its own interests. That is, the reality is such that in the world perception of people, any process is the interaction of certain multi-qualitatives. If we model the course of a process in order to prognose the future, then the question is, how many multi-qualitatives do we need to take in order for the prognosis to be consistent? The answer to this question is conditioned by the task, because if our task is to bring a megaton charge to the opponent, then the accuracy of the hit, plus minus half a kilometer, suits us in principle. If our task is to bring 150 kilograms of TNT to our opponent, then in order to be convincing, we must hit his window. That is, on the one hand, the requirements for prognostics are dictated by the task itself, and if the requirements for the accuracy of prognostics are worked out, then we can talk about which multi-qualitatives should be brought into consideration and which ones should be considered insignificant. But, taking into account the fact that our psyche is two-level, consciousness 15 bits per second and 7 to 9 objects at the same time, then our task is to set the correct task for our unconscious levels of the psyche, and they themselves will determine with what multi-qualitatives to work and how. The next law of dialectics, the second law, is the transformation of quantitative changes into qualitative ones and qualitative changes into quantitative ones. In chemistry, there is such a phenomenon, isomorphism, when different chemical substances have the same chemical composition, but by virtue of the fact that they are different substances, then their chemical properties are different, but the number of atoms in the molecules of their varieties is the same. This phenomenon of isomorphism does not fit into the law of transformation of qualitative changes into quantitative ones, and vice versa, for the simple reason that different chemical substances arise due to the fact that in their molecules the same atoms are ordered differently. And when Hegel formed this law, formulated it, and then when this law was adopted by Marx, Lenin and other Marxists, the phenomenon of isomorphism was known. And in almost all languages, numbers are divided into cardinal and ordinal, which was also known. If you mix cardinal and ordinal numbers in the same process, without seeing their boundaries, then you can make such a joke that arouses the interest of children. The child can be offered. A person has 11 fingers on his hands. The child asks the question, how come? It can't be so. 10. Let's count. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and there are 5 more on the other one, which makes 11. Where's the rub? And the rub is in the fact that when counting down, the numbers 10, 9, and so on appear in the meaning of cardinal numbers, and 5 is a quantity of fingers on the other hand. The addition of cardinal and ordinal does not lead to the result that really is. Therefore, the law of dialectics about the transition of quantitative changes into qualitative ones also does not very much correspond to reality. Further, the third law of dialectics is the law of negation of negation. That is, at the first stage we negate something, at the second act we negate the first negation. Where does this lead? You have a fight with your wife. F off. She F's off. Negation happened. It seems for you that you overreacted. You say, come back. F off, she says. If you look at how the law of negation is perceived in life, then this is an orientation towards destruction and degradation. They completed construction, the house is under the roof. They removed the roof, destroyed the walls, destroyed the foundation. All these are acts of negation of the previous negations. And if, nevertheless, the laws of dialectics are imposed, the psyche does not reject them, and they are present in the psyche, then what will happen? The following will happen. They will cut off from man's world perception and will cut off from the results of his decision of prognostic tasks everything that does not fit into these formulations. It happened that I saw how a person worked out an opinion adequate to life. But due to the fact that this opinion did not fit into the formulations of the laws of dialectics and the omnipotent doctrine of Marx, and it's omnipotent, as they said, because it's true, he rejected the obviously adequate, correct opinion, which simply did not fit into the dogmas of the teaching with which he had agreed.
Да, но тут дополнение даже, что не только диалектика и марксизм, а это к любому относится. Когда у человека есть система мировоззрений и вера во что-либо.
Yes, dogmas, they limit, enslave, and so on. It turns out that this one single phrase from the encyclopedic dictionary, that Socrates is one of the founders of dialectics as the art of comprehending truth by posing leading questions, is the only thing that should be said about dialectics. Everything else that history and philosophy offers you is already from the devil. But if this is art, then it is not formalizable, not algorithmizable, for the simple reason that every cognitive act is unique. And by virtue of its uniqueness, it is impossible to build such a system which we encounter when installing a program package, for example, such as CorelDRAW. When the program installer asks a whole bunch of questions on the theme, put ticks whether you need or don't need these options. You put the ticks, you get the result. With dialectics, this variant does not work. There are no general formulations where you can put some ticks and, as a result, get a functionally operable algorithm for solving a task. In other words, dialectics is really art. But, although art is not formalizable, nevertheless, any art school, is based on some principles that can be described lexically. If it is impossible to describe them lexically, then it is possible to make it so that one can feel them through. This circumstance leads to the question of why dialectics, in the psyche of some people, allows solving tasks by formulating questions explicitly, or without formulating questions, but nonetheless, questions somewhere in the depths of the psyche are formed, and intelligible answers to them come to the level of consciousness. The answer to this question is connected with worldview systems and with the peculiarities of the psyche of every one of the people. First, everything related to worldview systems. Dialectics can be limitedly functionally operable in the worldview and world understanding on the basis of the four-component set, matter, spirit, space, time, for the simple reason that spirit contains non-determinacies in relation to information and algorithmics. If the unconscious levels of the psyche resolve these non-determinacies adequately, then, in this system of ultimate generalizations, dialectics, as a method of cognition by posing questions, can be functionally operable, but limited. In the system of world understanding, in which the triunity of matter, information, and measure is the ultimate generalizations, dialectics is more functionally operable. This is the answer to the question as to why the I-centric, four-component system is offered to everyone, and it is cultic in science and philosophy, and the triunited system is the lot of a very narrow circle of esotericists, precisely because it provides an advantage. The second question is related to the fact that it is necessary to give an answer to the question, where do questions come from in the process of cognition? If questions arise within the framework of the system of elements, on the basis of which the worldview has already taken shape, then, in principle, everything can work on the basis of logics. What is it here? Why can't I match one with the other? But when it really comes to the cognition of something new, about creating something new, then the prerequisite for dialectical cognition, that is, posing questions, is an epiphany by distinction, which is in the hands of the Almighty. If attention catches what is revealed in distinction, the conscious will gives the command to the unconscious levels of the psyche to answer the question of what it is and how it's connected with everything else. Then what can be called the art of dialectics is triggered. If the picture of the world is not defective, if man's organism is not crippled, if the intellect is not split into several autonomously working and conflicting modules, this, from the point of view of psychiatry, is schizophrenia, then, by force of the fact that man is also part of the triunity of matter, information, and measure, and the world, about which questions are asked, is also the triunity of matter, information, measure, then the principle, such is the question, so is the answer, begins to work. To put it differently, the answer and the question are two mirror phenomena. A correctly posed question already contains half, and in some cases more than half, of the meaning of the answer to it. There is one of the variants that we sometimes practice. The student is offered not to answer questions about the course, but to ask questions about the course. In the majority of cases, this allows one to more clearly understand and see what the student has not properly learned and what he has not understood. The ordinary procedure: the student arrives, he takes an exam ticket.
Ну, если задача оценить полноту знаний, то обычно преподаватель тыкает угадайкой. Попасть в то, что...
Here a different variant is proposed. Have you attended the course? I have. Have you read the textbook? I have. What questions do you have? If a person really attended the course, understood something in it, read the textbook, then he cannot but have questions. Even if he did not come up with any questions when he was engaged in this, then these questions should arise when he is put before the need to formulate them. This applies to anything, be it mathematics, be it physics, biology, be it any technical disciplines. But if the person understands the problematics of the discipline, then he will always have questions that go beyond the textbook, or he will deepen something of what is in the textbook. If he is able to formulate questions, and there is a subject to talk in essence on these questions, then his knowledge can be evaluated more adequately than in a guessing system such as the unified state exam. Which of the 4 questions is correct and which is incorrect? Or in the traditional system, when a student takes an exam ticket and then he solves a task in accordance with what is in the ticket. Further, there arises a question on the functional operability of this very procedure. And here it turns out that if the emotion-meaning structure is correct, then the question will be formulated from the level of consciousness also correctly. Because the question at the level of consciousness, it is also somehow given out by the unconscious levels of the psyche. In other words, there is such a dialogue in which it's very difficult to catch the beginning. But the question goes into the unconscious levels of the psyche from the conscious levels of the psyche. If the emotion-meaning structure is correct, then the unconscious levels of the psyche also work correctly. If the emotion-meaning structure is not correct, then the unconscious levels of the psyche work incorrectly. And they can then give the incorrect answer to the question that is correctly or incorrectly formulated at the level of consciousness. Further, the question arises: if dialectics is art, then how to master it so that one's own psyche supports this art and cognitive creative acts are successful. It is clear that if art is not formalizable, then reading any instructions is stupid. What remains? What remains is one's own practical cognition and reading of one or another literature which captures this art of cognition in relation to certain problems. Because all literature, all texts are divided into 2 categories. The first category is the narration of what the author knows. I am telling you what I know. In Fundamentals of Sociology, what is known to the collective of authors is written. And the other category of texts, in principle, is analogous to a printout of the process of a computer. That is, when the text begins, then those who write it, they do not know how it will end. The text captures the procedure of precisely dialectical cognition. Such texts are also in the conception of social safety. They, in turn, can be divided into two groups. In one group, questions are posed explicitly. Then, after posing questions, some kind of argumentation is set forth, on the basis of which the answers to these questions are built. The other category of texts, where the dialectical procedure is captured, is somewhat more complicated, for the simple reason that the questions remain in the defaults. And, in the process of covering the problematics, some facts are given out, some kind of argumentation is built on their basis, and after that, there is a result. Such texts can be read in two variants. The first variant, we want to learn something, to understand the opinions expressed by the authors as a result of the dialectical process. This is reading number one. The second variant for reading such texts suggests an interest in something else. We are not interested in knowledge as such, but we are interested in the procedure of how it was obtained in this particular case. And so, if we are interested in the procedure of how it was obtained in this particular case, and if we read this text with the correct emotion-meaning structure, then in reality, we are drawn into the process of dialectical cognition. And by reading the text in this mode, we acquire the skill of dialectical cognition, which can be developed. In this mode, you can read Stalin. Stalin mastered dialectics. The mastery of dialectics was expressed in the fact that he was able to raise the Soviet Union from the plow and general illiteracy to the advanced technologies of his time and the highest level of education, especially among the youth. Reading Marx is pointless. Marx, this is a kaleidoscope. Vladimir Mikhailovich Zaznobin traveled to China to a conference on Marxism and said that there was a Japanese man there who was able to unearth in libraries the texts from which Marx compiled Capital. That is, the author's text of Marx in Capital. This is only links between excerpts from newspapers and magazines of that time, which, in some cases, are simply inserted into the text without references. This is a compilation. You can read Engels, Anti-Düring, Dialectics of Nature. But when reading Engels, one must remember that Engels thought in a system of the four-component set, matter, physical fields, spirit. Spirit was then considered non-existent. Space, time. In the work, Dialectics and Atheism, two essences incompatible, it is shown how Engels got lost in these three pines, and could not get out of them. In some situations, Lenin's dialectics is diabolical logic. By force of the fact that dialectics is not formalizable, it sometimes turns out to be very similar to diabolical logic. But diabolical logic is formalizable. Diabolical logic differs from other logics in the fact that axioms and rules change during the logical procedure itself as needed, or within those boundaries within which the opponent does not notice them when the rules and axioms are distorted. Therefore, with the help of diabolical logic, you can prove anything you want. The joke on the theme, man has 11 fingers on his hands, this is an example of diabolical logic, in which everything is built on the identification of ordinal numbers and cardinal numbers. Under the conditions of an atheistic world understanding, dialectics tend in a number of cases to degenerate into diabolical logic. And Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, in a number of cases, slipped from dialectics into diabolical logic, and was very convincing in relation to those who did not see the difference between dialectics and diabolical logic, who did not possess a more sophisticated diabolical logic, or had not mastered dialectics at a higher level than this art was mastered by Vladimir Ilyich. This is work with texts. There is one more procedure that allows you to master dialectics as an instrument of cognition. Now the World Cup is underway. Each game involves 11 players, 11 people on each side, the goalkeeper and 10 players, one of them is the captain. They chase the ball. The coat of arms of ancient Egypt is a ball carried by two wings. If we turn to the analysis of how Egypt was governed during the time of the pharaohs for several millennia, it turns out that the highest power in society is Jret's power. And the state power, Tsarist power, is always subordinate to Jret's power. Why? The reason is simple. Any governorial decision can be worked out either individually or collectively. That is, by some kind of intellectual headquarters, a brain trust, call it whatever you want. But when it comes to its practical implementation, the responsibility for the implementation can only be sole and personal. If this principle is violated, then such proverbs as 7 nannies can't say why their only baby lost her eye, or the Turkish proverb, 2 captains will sink a ship. Why? Because if the process of governance is led by one person, then, in one way or another, there flows down to him all the information that he requires about the course of this process, with one or another detailedness. But always, if he is a qualified governor, this information will flow down to him. If two or more people are at the head of the process of implementing a governorial decision, then there will always be some information flows that will not reach any of those who are supposedly collectively responsible for the decision. Example, for a long time, the American Admiral Hyman George Rickover was responsible for the creation of the naval component of the US nuclear strategic forces. He alone was also responsible for the ship and for the missiles that would be on the ship, and for ensuring that the missiles corresponded to the ship. At the same time, in post-Stalinist times, we had a collective leadership. So, no one was solely, personally responsible for such objects as the submarine plus strategic missile system. In the end, we got what we got. In post-Stalinist times, one of the slogans of the struggle against the personality cult was the slogan of collective leadership. The collective leadership ultimately led the Soviet Union to collapse, because no one was responsible for it. If we turn to Egypt during the time of the pharaohs, it turned out that the whole complex of governorial decisions in relation to the economy, internal politics, external politics of Egypt was worked out not by the pharaoh and not by the administration of the pharaoh. The whole complex of governorial decisions was worked out by the higher Jretzhood of Egypt. The higher Jretzhood of Egypt was represented by two teams, the team of the north and the team of the south. Each consisted of 11 people, led by the team captain or the first hierarch, as you wish. The rights of the higher Jretzhood in both teams were the same. In fact, they simultaneously worked on the problematics of the same questions, analyzing the problematics, thinking how to solve these problems, in what ways, by what methods, and they worked out some decisions. This system existed for many centuries. And pay attention, at the systemic level, it was programmed that situations were inevitable when people of equal rights on one and the same question came to mutually exclusive opinions. If they come to mutually exclusive opinions, then the question arises, what to do? In other cultures, these kinds of questions are resolved simply by voting, and the number of participants in the voting must be odd, and the right to abstain is blocked. The votes are somehow distributed, this or that decision is made, but a majority of people are also capable of making mistakes. And if, for example, society is faced with some problems and engages in social surveys on the theme of why these problems have arisen, then, if you put the range of answers correctly, you will get a certain majority and a certain minority. It turns out that in such situations, the opinion of the majority is not worth a dime, because the problems, if we analyze the process of their occurrence, have arisen as the result of the implementation of the mentality of the majority in this or that practice. But the opinions of the minority need to be analyzed, precisely because they do not coincide with the opinion of the majority, and there may be reasonable opinions about these problems. That is, the fact that a situation was programmed in the system when the question, in principle, could not be resolved by voting, suggests that there were some other procedures for overcoming disagreements. What other procedures can there be? For example, throwing lots. In the Quran, throwing lots is described as an act belonging to Satan. Why? Because if, for example, the first hierarchs decided to throw a coin, then from our point of view, they were magi. Therefore, in the question of how the coin will fall, not something higher is expressed in relation to each of them, but the result of the fact that the will of one turned out to be stronger than the will of the other. And, although he was wrong, the coin fell so that his decision won out. In one of the films, there was a wonderful plot. Two comrades decide the question of who will carry a heavy duffel bag behind enemy lines, throwing up a coin. The initiator of this idea says, if heads, then you will, and if tails, then not me. The second one says, okay, I agree. He throws up the coin, and it falls into the sand, on its edge. The initiator of this idea is forced to carry the heavy duffel bag. This is on the theme of the fact that in this, magic can be expressed. What else remains then? There remains one more thing. To get to the bottom of the reasons as to why competent and interested people came to two mutually incompatible opinions. What can the reasons be? Different informedness. That is, we check the database on the basis of which each of the opinions is worked out. Some know one thing, others know another. Some do not know this, others do not know that. If you combine the databases, what opinion will turn up? If this does not lead to an agreement, then the next thing arises. The intellect of someone processing reliable information has a glitch. We need to get to these glitches. And here come the nravious psychological aspects. If the person is full of ambitions and claims for personal copyright of the type, I am a genius, I solved such a problem that no one else could, then the showdown on the theme of whose psyche has a glitch becomes impossible. Because for self-loving, this is an extremely unpleasant procedure. But if there are no personal claims to copyright, and there is a desire to really solve the problem, then self-loving remains somewhere out there, and you can get to the bottom of the subjective personal reasons as to why, on the basis of the same information, the people come to mutually incompatible or mutually exclusive opinions. Then, the errors of subjectivism are revealed, and the correctness of one of the parties is recognized, or the errors of subjectivism of both parties are revealed, and as a result, a certain third opinion is born, qualitatively superior to the first two initial ones. The tandem mode of activity is also a way to master the art of dialectics, because the tandem mode is oriented precisely on detecting those glitches in the work of the intellect that do not allow the dialectical procedure in the psyche of a person to come to an understanding of the truth. How does it work? In principle, it can really be a dialogue. Life is arranged in such a way that the tandem mode of activity is programmed for man by his two-sexedness. And the best tandem is soulmates, the union of those who are soulmates to each other. There, in both cases, the maximum mastery of the potential for personal development is achieved. Another variant is a polytandem mode. The polytandem mode can also flow in two variants. One variant might be called chamomile. That is, when a project coordinator, in turn, discusses the same problematics with different people in a tandem mode, and as a result, a certain opinion arises on some question, which in one way or another is recognized by all the participants of the team. The other variant can be called syncophasotron, when the opinion wanders in a circle along a chain. As a rule, it is easier to do this if we have the source text, and all participants in the process are recognized as having the right to do whatever they want with this text. That is, they can enter into it whatever they think necessary, delete from it whatever they think necessary, engage in stylistic changes, engage in synonymous text transformation and refinement. If there is a basic skill of dialectics as an art, there are no personal ambitions, and fear that someone will wipe their feet with me, and I will look like an idiot against his background, then the process converges to the generation of a text in order to understand the depth of which the participants in the process, in some cases, need to develop personally for several years. Because only a few years after the final text, which satisfies all of them, appears, someone will be able to say, yes, here we did not write very accurately, and here we need to touch on a few more things. Why is the final text that satisfies everyone more intelligent than each of the participants? Because, in such a polytandem mode, a collective intellect takes shape, the power of which is manifoldly greater than the power of each of the intellects participating in the process. And only when several years pass, and people have not idled intellectually, but have engaged in cognition, creativity, and personal development, does individual intellect reach the level that was attainable for collective intellect in the past. To all appearances, in Egypt, this was the mode of functioning of statehood, when two Jrets teams exercised Jrets power independently of each other, and then agreed on a common decision and handed it over to the pharaoh, who was also initiated highly enough into the Jretsly secrets in order for him to coordinate all the work of the state apparatus towards implementing the decision into practice. This explains a lot in ancient history and explains a lot in subsequent history. Because in Russia, in the Russian Empire, the functions of Jrets power and state power were personally entrusted to the sovereign emperor. Since this procedure was excluded, the quality of Jrets power was either not achieved, as in the time of Alexander III, or, in principle, Jrets power turned out to be impossible, as in the time of, say, Peter III or Paul I. If we talk about the era of Catherine, then we owe the successes not to the intellectual power of Catherine, but to her intuition and the fact that her sensory system made it possible to fit into the processes and move in this flow in about the same way as a sailboat with correctly set sails moves under the impact of wind, including tacking against the wind. This is one of the modes of the work of the psyche, from the senses directly into a decision. But nonetheless, it was quite effective, since Catherine's intuition and senses were integrated into the psyche, but did not lie somewhere on the sidelines. If we talk about subsequent times, in Stalin's times, comradely relations between people were stimulated, including in the process of realizing creativity. The road to the tandem mode of activity was opened, and the polytandem mode was implemented, even without people realizing what it was. There is only one known case when there was direct enforcement to the tandem mode. During the implementation of the atomic project, two people could not agree on how and what to do. It took place in Beria's office. Beria said, "You are communists. If you are real communists, then you will come to the right opinion." He left them alone for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, they proved to him that they were communists, and they came to a mutually acceptable, correct opinion. And then, when a new stage of the cult of personal ambitions began, the quality of governance fell.
Вот хотел спросить, про Королёва, да, он же генеральным конструктором был, и вот вы говорите, что там при определенных условиях, да, коллектив работающий вот, и делающий как бы один и тот же конечный продукт может выйти на уровень, вот такая, ну, которую мы знаем, жесткая структурная субординация там, или доступ к информации. То есть, вот, мог ли кто-то...
I suspect that for Korolyov, to all appearances, the polytandem mode was the norm. Why? Once on the channel Culture, they showed a meeting with the academician Rauschenbach. This is one of Korolyov's associates. Rauschenbach was asked to describe Korolyov in one word. Rauschenbach thought a little, and then said that if you describe Korolyov in one word, then this word is commander. Because from his point of view, Korolev was neither an outstanding scientist nor an outstanding engineer. But if you correlate, what is the function of a commander? It is to coordinate the activities of very different specialists in a hierarchically organized system. Moreover, at long intervals of time. Korolev, in this sense, was a very good leader for his era. That is, for that collective and for that society in which he lived.
Еще вопрос. А вот, с историей вот нашей, там, если вот дальше откатываться, то вот, так не на слуху какие-то примеры, которые вот в государственном управлении вот на уровне там, да, вот Древний Египет, Древняя Русь, да, вот было ли у нас в жречестве реализовано вот каким-то образом эта функция, или у нас всегда сводилось к индивидуализму, что был вот здесь вот какой-то старец?
No. In our country, it did not boil down to individualism, because what is called jretshood was a general civilizational social group, just like the princely boyar class was a general civilizational professional community of executive governors. In those historical documents that have come down to us, it is attested that Novgorod itself summoned princes to govern, and that, during the princely appanage era, the princes did not stay in one principality for a long time, but there was a rotation of personnel. But this was due to the inertia of the era, when not the princes themselves decided the questions of rotation, but when the jretshood decided to whom to entrust what task to perform. There was a different system there. In our modern understanding, in Rus there was no statehood. But the system of governance, in some aspects, was more effective than the system of state governance in other civilizations. But this is another theme. This is closer to people's power, for the reason that access to the jret's power was open to everyone. And since, in nravious ethical terms, the society was one, that is, the same nraviousness and the same ethics were inherent for the jretses, princes, boyars, and so-called commoners, problems could not arise. Because the system of mutual subordination and mutual responsibility was functional. That is, outside the execution of official duties, a person is a person, regardless of whether he is a jrets, a prince, or someone else. If it comes to the execution of official duties, then others obey him, not because he is from a special ancestral line, but because he is a person who directs a collective activity and takes responsibility for this activity.
Можно ли сказать, что вот то направление, которое выкладывает в умах людей, давая концепцию внутренний предиктор, это вот какой-то вот такой пример, чтобы мы в этом направлении развивались?
Да.
Yes, because the conception of social safety presupposes the nravious ethical homogeneity of society.